Albert Lee Seed is proud to support the Back to the Roots podcast. Like you, they value the one-on-one conversations with farmers and other agricultural professionals that you hear on this show. Albert Lee Seed helps organic and transitional farms with a full line of organic and non-GMO farm seed for corn, soybeans, forage and pasture, cover crops, and cereal grains. Check them out at alseed.com. That's alseed.com. You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. This is Brian Wood, and along with Mike Klein, today we are actually in New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico, sitting down with Courtney White, who is an author, activist, and conservationist, among many other things, who's got a wide range of experiences. That includes working with regenerative ag out here in the West, which is what we're going to primarily focus on. But before we dive into that, Courtney, could you give us a little bit of your introduction and background?
Sure, and thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about stuff. My background, I come out of the environmental movement, actually, now many years ago. Sierra Club activism. When I moved into Mexico, it was with my wife. I was very concerned about some sort of classic conservation issues at the time, mining and public lands issues. And through the Sierra Club, I met a rancher, Jim Winder, who was a very interesting person, managed his cattle differently. At the time, there were a lot of conflicts between ranchers and environmentalists, particularly over public lands. And can make a long story short, he and I decided to start a nonprofit organization with another conservationist, Barbara Johnson, to kind of wade into the middle ground here, trying to create some friendly dialogue, at least, around what we now call a regenerative ag. We didn't call it back then. It was really more about cattle management and good grazing practices, those kinds of things. At the time, endangered species were a big issue. The wolf reintroduction was going on, and there was a great deal of bad blood and bad trust between the conservation community and the ranching community. So we decided to try to bridge some of that around some of these practices that we saw being developed at the time, which we now would refer to as regenerative. So that was so. My background as an environmentalist, I wanted an archaeologist. I'm farther back than that. I saw the value of cultures, particularly in northern New Mexico, where we have long-standing cultures, Native American and Hispanic, that the environmental community I felt wasn't paying a lot of attention to, wasn't honoring, and so we tried to find a way to honor those cultural traditions as well as get sustainable use of these landscapes. And that was kind of the meeting point for all of us, what we called kind of the radical center, which is how do you get practical and regenerative solutions on the ground collaboratively by working together. And this, of course, in the early days of the red-blue divide that now the nation's kind of caught up in. So that's my background. Came out of conservation, got involved in the regenerative agriculture movement through ranching. The original focus was on land health and land restoration. A lot of damaged land out here in the West, a lot of overgrazing historically, a lot of eroded landscapes, things like that. So we got involved with riparian restoration activities as well as agriculture, kind of looking at the whole picture. How do you get these lands back up, functioning better for all of us, whether you're rural or urban, and a lot of water issues out west. We're a dry state. For a period of time, we were in a crisis because there just wasn't enough rain and snow. So then how do you get these landscapes to function better so there's more water, more food? And that it just kind of kept going out from there. So we started really focused on cattle management and public lands, and then creating this common ground. And over time, we expanded it to include restoration activities on landscapes, and eventually got into farming, organic stuff, and then and then into carbon and soils and climate and kind of all things that were not on the radar screen in 1998, but are on the radar screen now. I didn't know anything about carbon and soils. God, nothing. Now I know a lot, and so it's neat to kind of walk this path, meet all these different, really smart, innovative, regenerative innovators doing stuff on the ground, whether farmers, ranchers, conservationists. And the world has really changed. I mean, the kind of that divide between conservation and ranching has closed and healed to some degree, because particularly around wildlife issues and open space issues, maybe a little less so on the kind of the animal agriculture side of things, because some folks still don't support animal agriculture. So we try to bridge all of that and also find innovative points where folks can kind of come together. So,
And what is the annual rainfall here?
Well, normally it would be about 14 inches, 12 to 14 inches. It's been up and down, of course, but it's been pretty dry. I don't know if we've gotten to 14 inches recently. Maybe this year we've had a pretty good winter. Last year maybe, but it's been low. It's been low. And we call Santa Fe, this area, we're at 7,000 feet. It's a high cold desert. So, we've got ponderosa trees up in the hills here, but a lot of it's pinon juniper, which is dry country trees, and most of that is winter snow and then big storms in the summer. That's how we get our precip. So it's this time of year, from here to end of June, it'll be dry. And that's tough. That's tough for folks, tough for ranchers. And farmers depend on a lot of surface water, irrigate, stuff that comes off the creeks. So it's a state that's kind of perpetually on the edge, right? Do we have enough rain? Do we have enough moisture? Do we have enough grass? That kind of stuff. So not like Ohio, of course.
So it takes a lot of acres per cow.
Well, so yes and no. So if under traditional management, conventional management, it would take a lot of acres. I think it can be somewhere 40 to 60 acres per head. But under the kind of ranch management that we advocated and worked with, it can take a lot less, meaning that the cows are bunched up and moved around the same amount of land, but as a tight herd. And so I'm not sure what the acreage per cow ratio would be there, but you can run more cattle on the same land if you manage them holistically as a group. And that was a surprise to me at the time, because I didn't know much about cattle management until I met Jim Winder, understood that there was kind of a different way of moving cows across these landscapes. So that ratio can drop pretty dramatically if you adopt these kinds of ranch management practices.
Because you would be giving the grass time to regrow and to come back. You're resting it and letting it be restored while the cattle are in a different... Same as the intensive grazing on dairy farms that I work with.
So similar. So it's all about time, what we call timing, intensity, and frequency. So how many animals are there, for how long they're there, but more importantly, how much time do you give that land to rest and regrow before you come back? So most ranchers here will graze, who do this style, will graze intensively for about 10 days, and then they're gone for the rest of the year. And this is in any particular place. So whether you use electric fencing or some other kind of means of controlling it, some ranchers use herders. They'll group the cows up. They'll graze, kind of like the buffalo, on the bison on the plains. They'll graze very intensively, and then they'll move away to somewhere else on the ranch and don't come back. And so, and many ranchers that we've worked with who have switched to this kind of management try to lengthen that period of time that the land is rested. So, and the biology is that plants want to be chewed on, right? So that's the way nature likes things to be bit and fertilized, but not overbit, not bit too many times, right? So then you get overgrazing. So the biting animal will remove the dead grass and allow the new stuff to come up. But so if a herd goes through and chews on the grass and then leaves, and then the grass is stimulated, right? So the nutrients and the roots and everything the grass grows, when the animals don't come back for a year, that's good. That works. And that's kind of the basic principles. And this all comes from Alan Savory, who was in Africa watching wild animals move around as herds and how they would disturb the soil and the brush and then leave, and then the land liked that little pulse of disturbance and would regrow, and be healthy, but not come back for a year or so. So that's kind of like, and that's where we started as an organization. I started as a conservationist. We just started talking about those kinds of issues, the cattle management issues. Most ranching out here is what they call continuous year-round grazing. They kind of turn the cows out, they spread out, they eat continuously. There's no management, and frankly, it's how you get overgrazing.
Because they're just going to grub down the areas where they love it, and not going to eat the areas where it doesn't taste as good. You see that in any grazing operation, because a cow is going to eat what they prefer, and then that area is just going to get trashed. Right.
And then if they particularly out here in riparian areas where the creeks are, which is where a lot of things will grow, tasty things will grow. That's where the water is, that cows will go hang out there if they're not managed, and they'll just trash those environments. And that generated a lot of conflict with the environmental community, worried about birds and other species that need those riparian corridors, fish in the creeks. And so if you had cattle just hanging out, loafing in these creek systems, eating everything, trampling, then that was bad for wildlife and habitat, and that would, especially on public lands, that led to a lot of conflicts. And so when I met Jim Winder, he said, look, there's a whole different way of looking at these landscapes. And so that's when we decided to form the Kuvira Coalition and put these ideas, management practices out there, partly for ranchers and farmers, partly for the public, partly to public lands managers and scientists. It was kind of a big tent. Anybody who wanted to explore kind of different ways of looking at these landscapes. And the fundamental thing was land health. What makes land healthy? I mean, what makes the soil healthy? And it doesn't matter what the use is. We can over-recreate. You can you can run ATVs across it, all kinds of things. If you're damaging the sort of the fundamentals of land health, how the water cycle works, how the mineral cycle works, plant roots, all that kind of stuff, then you're going to have degraded surface. And we thought, well, let's look at land health in general and talk about what are sustainable uses of these landscapes, no matter what it is that you want to use the landscape for. The principle, the biology, the ecology is fundamentally the same no matter what you do.
And it sounds very similar. I mean, basically the concepts that you're talking about are the same things we talk about back in the Midwest. I know that personally I think of the West as this new frontier of unknown for me personally, like how things are farmed out here. How can you farm in a desert, but I've never been out here. But the way you're talking is the exact same way we talk. The only difference is the climate that people are dealing with. But one thing that you mentioned in there that we don't have much in the Midwest is public lands. And how does that work out here, that farmers can graze animals on public land?
Yeah. So for your listeners probably may not know, so half the American West is publicly owned. So between national forest land, national parks, Department of Defense, which is public lands, though it's off limits, Native American reservations, and then mostly for us in this conversation, Bureau of Land Management lands, what's called BLM lands. And BLM lands were the ones that were kind of left over after the kind of land rush in the 19th century, and then Forest Service kind of took its lands, and the parks took, the kind of leftover land in between became BLM land, and that's publicly owned, and it's principally grazing country, though now it's mostly oil and gas country these days. So out west, one thing you can do in dry country is run cattle. You can run livestock. You have to manage them carefully, but this is great grazing country out here, particularly if you go east, when you get into the grasslands out there. It's still a low precip zone. You still have to be careful about what you do with the animals, but it's grass country, and and one of the things you can do with cattle if you manage them carefully is use these landscapes. I mean, it's easier in some ways to ranch ranch out here than it is to farm, because there's just not much water for farming out here, particularly if you have to pull it up out of aquifers. But you can, if you manage your cattle well, and historically it's been sheep country out here. The Spanish population, the colonists, and then 300 or 400 years of Spanish ownership out here was mostly sheep country. So public lands today, they're owned by the federal government. They are public lands, so every citizen in the country has access to public lands. Forest Service, Park Service. The link to agriculture is that historically, but way back in the 30s, particularly in the Forest Service, they just said to the ranchers who were here, we're going to put you on allotments, meaning we're going to carve up this public lands, and this is your allotment, and you have the right to graze here. So they're called grazing permits. They're renewed every, 10 years, something like that. And the rancher pays a fee to the government. It's not a big fee. And they have to abide by regulations and restrictions and that kind of stuff. So BLM's the same way. So ranchers many times, and they're recognized as, the permits are recognized as an IRS asset. So you can buy and sell them, that kind of stuff. And I have to tell you, we ended up being a permittee on public lands ourselves as an organization, which was a very interesting experience. And so for about 6 years, the Kuvira Coalition was a public lands permittee. We're on the forest over here. And actually, when we got into grass-fed beef, and it's kind of a long story. There was federal land management and the sort of triangulation with ranchers and environmentalists got kind of complex and a little bit antagonistic through the 90s and early 2000s. So a friend of ours ended up securing a permit and wanting to do some collaborative stuff up there with the Forest Service and ranchers and stuff. And we ended up inheriting it from him. And it's called a grass bank. It's just a way of kind of managing public lands. We ended up running a cattle herd ourselves as a conservation organization. Suddenly we're in the ranching business, and we got an application to join the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association in the mail, which for a Sierra Club activist was pretty interesting. We filled it out, sent it in. I don't think they quite understood what was going on, because they're not a fan of this collaborative work. And so for about 6 years, we were permittees on the National Forest. We had a 36,000 acre permit up on the mesa out near Rowe, and it was great. It was really interesting. We hired a rancher, a cowboy, to run the herd. It was a kind of a rainbow herd. We just kind of picked stuff up in the sale barn, but we did it as local grass-fed beef to Santa Fe. It was this is 2006, 2007, a little early for grass-fed. We hadn't quite had the public relations stuff that came out with Michael Pollan's book and other things that yet. But the response was great. People understood here in town, and we were selling hamburger at the farmer's market and all that kind of stuff. So it was, for me personally, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so I was a city boy. I went into the environmental movement, started a collaborative nonprofit, and then became a cattle rancher, which it was kind of a wild journey. Unfortunately, we were undone by the Great Recession in 2008, when for nonprofits, the money dried up. There just wasn't, the grant-making opportunities. And then the cost of a ranch, we had a board member at the time, rancher, who when we first started, he looked at this grass bank, 36,000 acres, and he said to me, "Courtney, this place has all the costs of a ranch and no income," which actually turned out to be true. And, we ran it on, as a nonprofit, we ran it on grants and things like that. But we weren't making that much money off a 60-head herd of cattle doing grass-fed hamburger to Santa Fe. So we ended up having to sell it in the end. And the grass bank model, the kind of the idea, proved bureaucratically to be difficult. There's a lot of issues with public lands out here that are frustrating. It's a great idea. It's a great model. The execution of it has gotten complex in the last 50 years, and now we've got an emphasis on oil and gas development out here, and that cattle ranching, everything else has kind of gotten pushed down. So Anyway, it was a good experiment. It was fun to go up there and be a rancher for a little while. I wish we'd be able to make more of a go of it, but it got me into food. So this was the missing link for all of us. So I came out of the environmental movement. We're talking about wildlife, public lands, environmental restoration, because we had a lot of damaged landscapes, and then how you kind of link these things together. I never really thought about the food link. Partly because the environmental movement, at least at the time, doesn't think about food very much. I mean, it thinks about, grass and wildlife and things. And then when we got in, when we took over the ranch and are producing food ourselves, I realized, this is really the common ground. I mean, this is how you bring people together, because everybody eats, right? And people want good, healthy food. And then at the time, all of that background education, Michael Pollan and Barbara Kingsolver and all those books coming out, really helped as people understood that what you eat and where it comes from makes a big difference. So then we began to kind of talk about food more, and that led the organization in different places that were good. I mean, to kind of think about the link between land management, food, not dairy. Up in this area here, there's very little dairy. Mm-hmm. We actually lost our last local dairy 25 years ago up here. But thinking primarily about meat, where grass-fed, whether it's cattle or something else, where it comes from. Mm-hmm. So.
And I think now that the food movement is really recognizing the grass-fed beef side,
right.
Well, grass-fed in general, but early on, the grass-fed beef got a bad rap,
right.
because it wasn't good. It was the old throw them out on the acres for the whole year.
Right.
Well, that meat is completely different than the grass-fed beef coming from sustainably managed, right. and your intensive grazing like you were talking
right.
about. So you were just a little bit too early.
We were. And I have to tell you, we kind of pride ourselves on being a little too early. So we have an annual conference, and which your dad spoke at once. And so I like to go find kind of heretics, in a sense, right? Folks kind of out there on the edge talking about stuff that other people go, what are you talking about? So we had, in 2003, we had Jo Robinson come speak at the conference. Do you know Jo? So she's a researcher and a writer focused on grass-fed. And so she was an early advocate for grass-fed meat, had written a bunch of books about it. And so I had her come out and speak, and the crowd wasn't ready. They understood kind of the background issues about land management, but in fact, I had a rancher say to me after her talk, Courtney, you can't be saying that about ranching and feedlots and stuff. And then about 6 years later, he was a grass-fed rancher himself, actually. And so the idea of all grass, no feedlots, was hard for folks to take at the time, and now of course it's everywhere, which is great. And we kind of followed that path on some other things as well, as we saw world changing and ideas changing, and particularly the regenerative practices coming up, how you produce grass-fed food so it's actually, I mean, you could produce it off of poorly managed lands. It's still grass-fed, right? But if you link it to well-managed lands, like you say, and then you get into tastier meat and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's and I got an education from the ranchers that I knew that were doing grass-fed early, including George and Julie up in Colorado, who understood that it was the right way, the nature's way of kind of managing these lands and animals, tastes better, and also is more profitable, as you know. I mean, they can get more per pound live weight off of grass-fed than they could.
Because well-managed, it's a lot harder to pack the weight on a beef animal with just grass. And especially if it's not managed grass, you're not going to get the gain that you need to make a living doing it. So well-managed grass-fed, I raise my own grass-fed beef, and I always brag about how good they're probably, I think they taste better than they actually do, but there's a satisfaction in finishing beef on grass, I think.
Yeah, totally. Let me tell you a little story that opened my eyes. A rancher who's not in business anymore, a guy named Sam Montoya. He was a retired educator and a a member of Indian Pueblo down here near Albuquerque, Isleta, Sandia. And anyway, so I met Sam early, and what he had done, he retired from his job, and he wanted to go into agriculture. So he asked the tribe to allow him to manage 93 acres of land. This is near the Rio Grande, so it's fertile bottom land. And it had been an old sod farm, and so they actually had taken all the sod off, and so it was a depleted landscape. So he said, look, here's what I'm going to do. So he divided it into 33 pastures with electric fencing, so 3 acres basically. And then he got a herd, about 200 head, and he put them out, and he rotated them through the 33 acres every month, and a little bit of irrigation. Before or after, I can't remember if he irrigated. And so he grew all this grass, entirely grass-fed. He said, I don't want anything that rusts, rots, or depreciates. And it was entirely profitable to him because he just moved the cows around and around. And everything else on his land greened up, everything around him stayed this sort of brown, dry, sandy land that nobody was... They've been overgrazed, frankly. And it was really interesting to watch. And we took a lot of tours there, and a lot of people just, he didn't want to spend much money. He was making money, but it was just a 200 head herd 200 head on 93 acres. So that, I don't know what that calculates out to, but he moved him, and he lived across the street. So he comes to walk, it takes me about 15 minutes. He'd lower the electric fence, and the cattle would go into the next pasture, and he'd put the electric fence back up, and he'd go home. I'm retired. I don't work too hard. And it was just such a cool model of how to intensively produce food, particularly in a dry environment like this, so that he's managing water resources very well. He's got 200 head on grass year-round, so he just moves them, and then when he decides to sell them, he watches the cattle cycle, and so he sells them. It was really a cool model. We and that's the sort of thing we like to find was like, wow, what works? What makes people money? What's good for the land? What produces food that's healthy for you? And so we spent a lot of time looking for models like that.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to ask before we go too much further, what is the difference between a rancher and a farmer?
A rancher and a farmer. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So one thing out west is there's a big difference between a rancher and a cowboy. And you don't call a rancher a cowboy. Cowboys are employees, right? So they're the men and women you hire to move the cattle. That sort of stuff. The rancher generally is the landowner. So it's the family ranch. They're the ones with the kind of larger vision. Farmers. So unlike Australia, where everybody's a farmer, right? Farmers here are farmers, and so they're crop growers, and so some of them will have integrated animals, goats, sheep maybe, but most folks don't. And so and the farming here in northern New Mexico is pretty small scale because we don't have a lot of water resources. So it's an active farming community, but all the acreage is fairly small. And so farmers are generally vegetable farmers, and ranchers are pretty much livestock farmers, okay. Livestock ranchers. Mm-hmm. So
the ranchers would not grow their own feed?
They would grow their own feed. Yeah. A lot of the ranchers we know won't, they'll hay, but they're not, haying here is different. So if you go out east, it's about the prairie grasses, and some of them get cut, but most of them are it's rangelands, and so you just move the cows around. Down in the bottoms here, folks will grow alfalfa and things like that and cut it. It gets a little complicated because if you get a chance to talk to George Whitten up in the San Luis Valley, it really bothers him when the farmers up there grow hay, cut it, and then send it out of state. He sees all that water and organic matter going out of state, going away. So why not keep it here and I keep it on the farm? So you have a fair amount of irrigated ground doing alfalfa, things like that here, which is fine. I mean, it's profitable.
We do see hay from the San Luis Valley hit Ohio.
Yeah.
Simply because their quality of their alfalfa is off the charts.
Where I live outside of town, we see it going down to the dairies in the eastern part of the state. So what George does, if you get a chance to talk to him, they hay, but they lay it down and they keep it there, and then they row graze, and so that they'll grow. It's not alfalfa. It's their native grasses. So they'll grow it, hay it, and put it down, and then in the winter they will just move the electric fence around, and so the animals have always got the feed in front of them. So that's how he likes to keep the resource on the farm. Mm-hmm. So the carbon and the water and everything, so that all stays there. Strip grazing, I think, is the correct term. Strip grazing?
I think so.
I can't remember now.
Because guys will do the strip grazing by leaving the round bales in the field as well, and then just moving the fence beyond.
Yeah,
like they'll lay them all out in the fall.
Right, and then just move the fence.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And not too many other people do that here. Again, a lot of it is to sail to the dairies or whatever that need the feed, that kind of stuff. So,
to me, it sounds like ranchers are people that raise animals, in this case livestock, using the landscape that they have, whereas farmers are managing the landscape to raise the animals. It's kind of that sounds to me what the difference here is.
Yeah.
But
and there's northern New Mexico is unique in a lot of ways. I mean, we have a very old Native American tradition here. The Pueblos ancestrally, prehistorically, go back thousands of years, and they've been here. Then the Hispanic population came in 400 years ago, and have been here. And there's been a lot of sustainable use, and good practices through all those years. And those communities are still here, and then the Americans took over in about 150 years ago or so, and so you have this kind of very much a dynamic, and everyone's got a different perspective on agriculture, different traditions at work here, and it's been neat to kind of see the blend of sort of the milpa system, which is a kind of a Native American corn, bean, squash combo, and then the livestock issues and things like that come in. So it's a great place. There's always something exciting culturally, historically going on. Northern New Mexico, and it was very tough politically, particularly for environmentalists for many years, because particularly around forest issues, wood use issues, that kind of stuff. So,
have you seen a lot of positive in the last? Well, since you started in, was it 98 with Kuvira?
98, yeah.
What is the biggest thing you have seen for the better, and then maybe something that kind of went the other direction?
Well, yeah. So what I tell folks is that, in 1998, when we all got started, the toolbox, the regenerative toolbox, which you could pull out of it to use on a landscape, was fairly limited. So, we started off looking at livestock management, just how do you move cows around. And then we got into creek restoration, which more of a technical issue, but we have lots and lots of degraded creeks here. And there was a very nice regenerative toolbox invented by a guy named Bill Zedek that uses sticks and rocks and carefully placed. So that toolbox has grown over time. And so part of it is an economic, it's not just a practice. So being paid for grass-fed beef. So grass-fed beef became part of it, the toolbox. And then different kinds of agricultural practices, farming practices, grass banks, things like that as that kind of toolbox. So I've had the honor of watching that toolbox grow as more and more farms and ranches not just came on board, but as they innovated, particularly on subsoil stuff, carbon, micro critters, so that when we got started it was all above ground management. How do you move the cows around to get the animals to eat the plants in the right way? And then later we got involved with folks who were looking at carbon in soils and the water holding capacity and what management techniques, not just composting, but other things that would enhance carbon capture and control. And so that toolbox is really spread out. So then you've got permaculture and biodynamic and organic, and all now kind of under this regenerative umbrella. And top of that was collaborative work, working together with folks, because we found we have a before I left the organization, we had a long-running creek restoration project for Rio Grande cutthroat trout, which is the native fish. And it's very important to fisher people, is be able to have a chance to go up there and fish. Well, these systems are highly degraded. So we got involved with a big collaborative group to kind of do that. So cattle management was part of it. Creek restoration was part of it. But getting all those different ideas together, people have different ideas and talk about things. They hold one thing up and look at it all these different ways. And that was really cool. So that toolbox has expanded over time, and that's been exciting to watch. I mean, it's also neat to see the commercial enterprises that depend on these things expand out. So more cooperatives, more private businesses, groups like Organic Valley expanding. That's been great. The thing that's been hardest, and I've given this a lot of thought over the time, is how we take all these grassroots level innovation and scale it up in a way that more people will do it, and that's been hard. That's been hard. Economies of scale, getting conventional agriculture to move more in this direction. Getting some of the environmental communities still is resistant. To get into animal agriculture issues, so kind of at those levels, it's sort of frustrating to see so much innovation at the ground level, and then you go up where policies and big ag are more resistant to these ideas. That's been frustrating. For
those of us that see these, regenerative agriculture practices being put into place and seeing them work tremendously, it's hard to understand why big ag and conventional agriculture seems to fight back. But what, in your experience, has been some of the arguments that they make against doing?
Yeah, it's sort of like the big question, and we've struggled with it because as we worked at Kuvira and we saw this toolbox expand, and we saw all the benefits that would accrue people who do that, but we didn't see a lot of numbers, a lot of ranchers moving in this direction. We asked that question a lot ourselves. Why is it that folks seem to not just resist, but there's a fair amount of hostility as well. It's like, and the only thing I can come up with is that we were challenging people's belief systems. It's like asking somebody to change their religion. We can talk. I had a ranch. One of our board members, Roger Bowe, who was a rancher out east. He inherited the ranch from his dad. His dad had been pretty conventional rancher. Roger switched to this holistic management, and really the ranch came back to life. He tells the story that there's Indian teepee rings out there he didn't know existed. He saw them, but when he changed his management, the grass came back and a spring came back right where the teepee rings are. And so he realized that there was all this kind of other stuff going on. But he tells the story that his neighbors would come over and they'd look around and they'd see all the grass. And they still, and Roger was an economist and he had the numbers. He at one point was making 2,000%, annually or something on what he was doing. And they would still say, well, it just rains more on your ranch, obviously. Or they'd ask him about his cattle. What breed is that cattle? And Roger didn't care what breed the cattle are because it's the way it's managed. And he got pretty frustrated because people would they would literally be looking at him as land, as cattle, and still not see it. And then he in dialogue with him, he just explained to me, just realized that it's just kind of a belief system. It's folks just don't want to change what they believed in for a long time, even if you throw a lot of numbers at them, so data, or pictures or economics, profitability. Some will, and some early adopters will, and some folks will still, but it gets it at some core. Almost religious beliefs, I guess, and how you look at the world, and that's what we sort of came up with in the end. And I don't know what you do about that. I mean, that's most of the ranchers we know who made these changes either were early adopters, meaning they were just ready to change, or they got in a crisis. Mm-hmm. an economic crisis, losing the house. Gabe Brown, Gabe Brown. So Gabe's story is a classic one where they went through 4 years of severe crisis. And on the other end of it, had to change. Mm-hmm. Now he realizes it was the right thing to do. So that describes actually a fair amount of folks out here who adopted early, changed their ways. They reached Jim Winder, the rancher I knew, he inherited his dad's ranch, and it was just losing money. And he said, either I have to change this or I'm going to go out of business. So,
and I think some of it is, well, it's exactly what you said. It's economic incentives either being given to go that direction, which are coming with consumers being more aware of these practices, or economic incentives being taken away on the other side, which is also happening in today's climate. But one question for you would be, with the consumers being more aware now of regenerative agriculture, I mean, that's a buzzword right now for sure, even so much that General Mills now has a regenerative agriculture program that a million acres is going to get transitioned by 2030, I think it is. So seeing that, do you see that? I mean, it's hard not to see it as a positive, but do you see that as a step in the right direction that these big food companies are?
Yeah, and that gets back to that scale issue we were just talking about. You can kind of go little farm by little farm, ranch by ranch, but at some point it has to kind of start going up, and that means you need to engage the larger companies at some point. I don't know enough about it to know if they're sincere. I don't know. What I like about regenerative ag, and why I like it as a title, in the word regenerative, is stuff that you can actually demonstrate, right? Is it truly, do you have the microbial life in the soil that actually is regenerating itself? Do you have the carbon content coming back? I mean, you actually can take these things. So a lot of the cattle management when we first got started was more qualitative. Well, we think it looks better, I mean, and we're taking little samples here and there, but generally it's kind of a feel-good thing. And I mean, you can tell. But what's nice about what the microbiologists have given us is there's some good numbers now, some good hard science about what's going in the soil, so they can measure it carefully. So is it being regenerative? Well, let's run the numbers, yes or no. Are they going up? Are they going down? Mm-hmm. Do you have more mycorrhizal fungi in the soil? Do you have more diverse biotic communities? That kind of stuff. And then it actually is regenerative. So I don't know what General Mills is up to in that regard. But there's always going to be a certain amount of sort of corporate PR in these things. I mean, and we saw it in, the grass-fed went through this. What is grass-fed? Is it 100%? Is it the silage count? What do you do in the winter? I mean, is it, and then you get into the questions of standards and protocols, which blew my mind. I just wanted land to get better and people to work together, that kind of stuff. So I don't know where we are on the technical side of what's regenerative, but if the land isn't healing and coming up in the health that you can see in the soil, then I don't think it's regenerative.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the hardest part to figure out is how can I be economically viable and still be building the soils.
Right.
And the one thing that's happening in conventional ag over the last 5-8 years that's a positive thing is the cover cropping. Mm-hmm. And Gabe Brown is a huge part of that.
Right.
Because they're seeing the benefits of that. So if that part of the regenerative system works, why wouldn't some of the others?
Right.
But that's for large conventional ag, that is a very small step, but I think it's a very important big step as well. So I think there are some exciting things going on, but it goes back to just what you said. It is a belief system that is ingrained from generation to generation.
Right.
And do you dare make that move when Grandpa is going to he won't be able to believe
or your neighbors.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone lives in a community. And so some of the ranchers we knew, that wasn't so important to them, so they're willing to kind of buck the trend and deal with the community reaction. But a lot of folks are sensitive to how your community feels about it. So I don't know much about the no-till movement, but I know that there's been a lot of progress on it. If you go back 40 years, there wasn't a lot of no-till. Now there's much more no-till, even though it's more conventional no-till. And I got a lot of this out of talking to Gabe about that transition. But that's belief systems will change incrementally, as long as you're still. It was funny because what I didn't understand as an environmentalist when I got into this was that most environmentalists want ranchers just to get out of business, right? Just stop ranching, get the cows off. What we were advocating was keeping ranchers in business. So you're in business, you just move your cows around differently. So you're still doing all the ranch work, cowboy work, all that sort of stuff. But we still couldn't get people to change, even though it was still ranching. That's where the belief system comes in. It's not like we're asking folks to change, I don't know, from farming to ranching, let's say. You might got to stop ranching, you got to go farming. We're asking them just manage the livestock differently. So it's the human psychology part of it, relationships. I underestimated when we got started. I thought, well, you show more profitability and these sort of things, and people will change. No, it's more complex than that. What I like about Gabe, by the way, many things about what Gabe is doing. One thing that probably less well known maybe than what he talks about a lot is how he stacks enterprises on his farm, so that he's got on a foundation of healthy soil and cover crops. He's got all these different businesses that all kind of weave together. So pigs and the different kinds of crops that he grows. He's got bees. Everything's all kind of linked together. So he's no one enterprise is dominant really in his system. They all link together and they're all making money for him. And I think that I see that in other places that are doing well. They stack these enterprises kind of based on the soil health, but they've got different things going on at the same time on one farm, and that generates income, but also buffers against market fluctuations, things like that. That seems to be really an important part of this.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that comments, in organic production, organic right now, as a lot of farms have moved towards just specializing in one type of production, whether it's dairy, eggs, pork, whatever it may be. And with the downturn in all those markets, and that includes conventional and organic, they're all down. Farmers are just plain old struggling right now. The questions are coming back. In the good old days, in the past, Grandpa used to have 100 chickens and 5 sows and 20 dairy cows, and that kept them diversified. And so those questions are coming back of how can we do that over again. And I think that's as far as small farm resiliency is absolutely needed. It's just a hard thing for a single farmer all by himself to create some of those markets.
Well, and Gabe, everything on, and Joe Salatin would fall in this category too. Everything that he is doing is all integrated, meaning that they have a function. So the chickens follow the cows, so they're eating the insects that come out of the cow patties, and then the pigs get in there. So they all have a job to do. They all kind of weave around, and then they all get harvested. The eggs, the meat, whatever. So that so he's building soil while he's making money from all these different enterprises. The bee story on this ranch is great because there was a bee company, honey company there in Bismarck, said, look, can we just, put some apiaries out, some boxes out, and then he gets a cut of that, and they have great honey to sell. And so it's like a win-win for the company and the farmer at the same time. But you got to be willing to kind of work on all those levels and deal with all those people, and he direct markets, so it's all about direct marketing. So it's a job. It's a job, but it seems to me kind of where things have to go, especially under variable climate conditions. To kind of be able to buffer yourself at the ups and downs and floods and drought and all that kind of stuff. So. Dave Brandt, though, he's right. Dave's not far from you, probably, right? I mean,
Dave Brandt, he's in Central Ohio. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he was kind of an early adopter of no-till and those kinds of things too, right? So.
And when you look at like the animals and the different species that Gabe has on his farm, I look at that as a diverse pasture.
Right.
Where now he's taking. We have a lot of farms that are monoculture on cows,
right?
Or whatever it may be. But he's bringing all these different animal species in, same as the diversity of the crops in your field.
Right.
And that closed loop system of that feed going through an animal back on the land, that cycle is still what gets me excited.
Yeah. Right.
And I would love to see farmers getting back to having 5 or 10 sows, but but big commercial production ruined that. The only ones that can do that are if you can find small direct markets for that. Because the small co-ops that you could market through are all gone. So it's almost like they're back to step one of finding all these markets, because you can probably have a market for your milk, and for some of your crops, but the other stuff that you're going to have to find those markets. And I think as you mentioned food earlier, the younger generation is much more aware of where they want to know where their food comes from and all that. So I think there's going to be more and more of these regional food hubs are going to keep popping up because the consumer's demanding it. And if the consumer demands it, somebody will figure out how to get it there.
Yeah, and that's, I read an article by Joel Salatin on that very point. He said basically, farmers are good at what they do. Give us a market, give us market demand, and we'll meet it. He calls it pool. Give us the pool. Suddenly there's not enough pigs. I don't know, whatever, and we'll fill it. But you got to get. So it's all for him. It's all about consumer education, creating that pool from the marketplace that then the farmers respond to. So. What I don't understand, and it's completely beyond my pay grade, is all the tariff issues and the subsidy issues and dairy in particular. And it bewilders me. What I see out here is good land management has all of these collateral effects. So you can stack enterprises, but the creeks get better, and that helps wildlife, and that helps hunters. Water supply in a dry country like the West is very important. And so where does the water come from? It comes from up high, public lands, then it flows through private lands. If they're poorly managed, then we've got water quality issues, or we're losing water, those kinds of things. So it's all linked together. It's complex, but it's also exciting because everybody's got a role to play. The question is, how do you get people economically compensated for good management? And as you know, that's hard. And a lot of talk over the years about carbon markets or added value onto these products for water management. I know California, they've been thinking about some of these issues, and then it just it gets, the kind of market side of this is something that's beyond. I'm not an economist, beyond my knowledge base, but I see all this good stewardship, and I see all the collateral benefits. If we just figure out how to get the public to pay more,
it is
hard.
It is happening through economic. I'd say Gabe Brown and Joel Salatin are examples of it working, of that happening on a small scale, and like Mike said, through regional food systems. I'm sure there's ways from the public side to incentivize farmers, but it seems that as the public, a consumer, is learning more and being more aware of what some of these practices are, and then willing to pay more to support that local guy. That's where you start being able to see that economic return for that farmer. But that sounds great in theory, but is easier said than done. But overall, when you said how sincere is General Mills in this regenerative thing, that's the same question that I think a lot of people are asking. But if they're willing to give an economic incentive to a farmer to have good practices,
nothing wrong with that, Yeah. And as I said before, that there's a lot of ways to measure these things scientifically, and so I would hope that the farmers are meeting standards. I don't know. Percentage of soil carbon or microbial life, or those kinds of things, as a way of demonstrating they're actually being regenerative. And then you've got bigger scales. How do you? When things get more expensive, the food gets more. Then obviously there's a drop off on what people are willing to pay, and again into some justice issues. It's just for people who can afford it, and it gets, as it gets multi-layered pretty quick here, and policies, farm bill. There's all kind of craziness. What I've been excited about is that if you go back, as I said before, you go back 25 years, that the toolbox was small, the conversations were small, the kind of effects were small, just kind of a little group kind of talking among themselves. You got some crazy ranchers and crazy farmers, crazy environmentalists, and a few scientists kind of going, hey, there's a different way of looking at this world. Same land, just a way of looking at it differently. That's really grown a lot. I mean, over the last 25 years, which is exciting. I mean, it's neat to see the public, particularly young people, like our kids, who grew up traveling to these ranches, but still they talk to their friends. The consciousness about where your food comes from, what's in it, is it bad for you, is it good for you? I mean, particularly, does it have an effect on the climate, which is what driving a lot of young people today concerned about. They all link together, but then how do you make it pay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we had talked about this the other day, Brian, that if we can do the regional food stuff and stop having the supply chain eat up all the profits,
right,
we can maybe get the farmer a sustainable price on his farm. But wow.
Yeah.
That talking about an undertaking there.
Really?
But our whole society is addicted to cheap food.
Right.
And
totally.
You look at a $4 burger.
Right.
And if you have a healthy option for $8,
right,
I would eat it, but there's people that couldn't.
Right. No, that's right.
So if we would just spend more on our food, the quality of food, a lot of other problems would diminish, I believe.
Right,
but
right.
We're talking about locking the gate long after the horses are gone.
Right.
So because that is almost to the point of being a pipe dream, because of cheap food is everywhere. But if we can just somehow get more of that money back to the farmer.
Right. Yeah.
Because if the farmer isn't viable, his kids are not going to want to keep going.
And there was a story in the Washington Post last week. I mean, I knew this, but it was interesting to see the story. Basically, the reporter told in this long story said, "Hey, your cheap hamburger? Guess what? It's ground up dairy cows. They've been worn out, given all this, it's off the commercial system. Given all this stuff, growth hormones, whatever. They got 3 years, 4 years, and they get ground up into your cheap hamburger." It was, I knew that, but I think it was kind of a shock to see it in the front page of the Washington Post, because people say, oh, cheap food, yeah, it's hamburger. I mean, what, oh, no, it's ground up dairy cows. So the other challenge is, and I don't know if you guys have dealt with this in your interviews, is, the oncoming kind of synthetic revolution, which I think right now probably poses more of a challenge to agriculture than environmentalists or other things. Because, so after I left the organization, I went into writing full time, partly my own stuff, but partly co-authoring books. And so I worked on a number of books, including one on fiber sheds. Do you know about fiber sheds?
I do not.
Oh, she's out in California and she doesn't travel, but if you get a chance, you should talk to her at some point. If you ever got to California, her name is Rebecca Burgess. She runs a nonprofit in the Bay Area called Fiber Shed. And what she's doing, it's the same model, regenerative agriculture, animals, farmers, ranchers, local economy, but based on fiber and where our clothes come from. And her point is that we use the word regenerative a lot. We think a lot about food and water. We don't think about the thing that's closest to our skin, which is our clothes. So she started this whole regenerative fiber movement. And the ranchers, the same kind of ranchers that we were talking about, whether it's mostly about sheep and wool and the cotton plants. So she's really done a fabulous job of rethinking the whole fiber thing. So we worked together on a book that came out in November called Fiber Shed through Chelsea Green Press. And in that book, she asked me to write a chapter about synthetic biology. So in the fiber community, there's an ongoing thing about basically growing clothes in your petri dish. I mean, that's more sort of metaphorical, but basically what's going on is that they're creating synthetic fibers, look like fibers, based on sugar and genetic genetically modified organisms, at a real kind of a high level. And that was an eye-opener for me. I hadn't really thought about, GMOs at that level, which is pretty extreme. She's very concerned about it, and she's concerned that if we just start getting our clothes from synthetic biology operations, it'll drive more farmers and ranchers off the land, because then, if you're getting your fake wool and not thinking about the consequences, this is GMOs with sugar produced who knows where, under what conditions, being pitched as sustainable when it's really not. And she's advocating for farmers and ranchers producing wool in local mills, all that sort of stuff. If those economics will change if everybody just shifts right straight to synthetic fiber. And now, of course, as you know, you've got synthetic meat, all around us and growing, and now you've got advocates saying out loud that we should just get rid of farming, right? You've heard about the food without farming movement, right? It's like, just grow it all in petri dishes, like Star Trek. I don't know. It's weird. But anyway, you've got that background issue. We found here that if you want these landscapes to be healthy and productive, you need people on them. And if you're going to be on them, they need to do a good job of managing them. They need to be paid. But you also have to give them the support system culturally, right? Markets and, policies. If we're all just going to shift to this synthetic world, I don't know what that means, to be honest with you. It's just weird. Anyway, so I don't know if you've talked to folks about, synthetic meat. I don't know about dairy. There's not synthetic milk coming down the road, is there?
Well, I would call, it's not exactly, but almond milk, oat milk, those kinds of things are almost synthetic milk. So it's still from a plant, I suppose.
Right. But from a industrially produced plant.
Right. A monoculture.
Monoculture.
That is and sprayed halfway to death. Right. So.
Mm-hmm. But I think there is a synthetic milk that has been talked about, and I'm sure you could make anything. They could figure out a way to make anything synthetic, and I agree with you, and I don't know if it's just fear because it's what we work with and what we see, or is it, I think in my mind it's a legitimate fear that what's going to happen if we do make that full-on switch to these synthetic ways of living, and what happens to this ground that's been that is moving in the direction of good management and revitalizing the landscape, and
we need rural people, rural populations. We need people in these landscapes. The thing I've learned through all my experience is that I've written about this is that at the end of the day, nature still knows best. Nature just still knows more than we do. Nature, photosynthesis has been around a long time. And, that whole process of turning CO2 into sugars, feed the plant roots, go into the microbes, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, we got away from, because industrial ag just really interrupted all of that, chemicals and things. Now we're rediscovering that. Nature still has the best ideas. And everything about the synthetic world is contrary to that. And so instead of going back to, I don't mean back to nature, but back to the biological principles that worked effectively for a long time, we just go zooming off here to more synthetic. It's just another form of industrial production. It's just extreme genetic engineering. If we go that way and we leave what's worked behind, I don't know what that means. I don't know where we go then. I don't know where this branch off into extreme GMOs gets us ultimately. But anyway, so I've been an advocate for most of my life for natural stuff. That's animals. Nature never farms without animals. Yeah, anyway, so it's neat to see regenerative agriculture rediscovers stuff, and that's largely what it's about. So herding, for example. So bovines like to be in a group. They just like to be in a group, and when we spread them out over these landscapes, it's kind of weird. So you bring them back, you herd them, you move them around as nature intended, and that's what we need more of, I think, not less of. And so we're at this kind of moment here that I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go, to be honest with you.
I think we're at a moment that's kind of scary because we have the younger generation are very interested in saving the planet and all that, but at the same time you've got all these synthetic things that you just talked about coming. And which way are they going to go? Is that going to save the planet, or do we need to try to get local food and do it that way? So we're at a kind of a unique spot, I think.
Oh, totally. If you look at climate and CO2 and the atmosphere, however we feel about climate in general, at least CO2 gets processed through photosynthesis and gets turned into stuff in the soil. That's cool, and that's shovel ready, and that has all kinds of benefits for us. And so if we can push regenerative agriculture that has, climate benefit, then everybody kind of wins. But if we just shift over to monocropped almond production or palm oil production or sugarcane production to feed a synthetic system that then pushes, I don't know, it's just weird. That's I'm old enough to think, like, why is this happening? I know humans like to invent things and push boundaries, and we're tech heavy as our culture, but there are some things that really ought to not be replaced, which is how nature works. I read somewhere they were trying to improve the efficiency of photosynthesis through, I don't know whatever you do. It's like, really? It's pretty, it's not efficient enough. The world is not an engineering problem. It's not and people look at it, it's just an engineering problem. It's not an engineering problem. Anyway, so I'm both encouraged, and I see I'm working on a book right now that looks at different kinds of regenerative practices and their climate effects, but through oceans and forests, and not just agriculture. We through a lot of good science, we have an idea of how all these systems work together and well. But it's kind of a race to that versus the race to this synthetic thing at the same time. And I'm not sure who's going to win that race, to be honest with you.
And to kind of tie it all back together, what we talked about earlier was regenerative agriculture. What we need is visible results. And if people see that, if the public sees what a good regenerative managed farm can do, they will support that, which hopefully the people that we talked about that have a belief system, the farmers that are doing the continuous grazing or need 60 acres per cow and, grubbing down to bare dirt, basically, hopefully they have in their hands the chance to show that the public that regenerative can do the right thing, and we can head in the direction of more regenerative rather than the synthetic. Because if the public keeps on seeing the detriment that large scale, whether it's chemicals or overgrazing, whatever it may be,
feedlots,
the damage that can do, they will continue to go in the direction of synthetic.
Totally. And that's and that's what we're all seeing. In fact, I went to a lecture here in town. A young genetic engineer came and talked about the nitrogen problem in agriculture. The nitrogen problem. She meant industrial agriculture, the nitrogen problem, and she said the answer was basically buy our microbes. And I really wanted to stand up and say, I didn't do it, stand up and say, hey, there's another alternative. It's called organic agriculture. You don't have to, torture microbes at a profit to the company. Why don't you go back and fix the nitrogen problem the old-fashioned way? The way Gabe solved his nitrogen problem by, getting the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle working naturally on his ranch through regenerative agriculture. Anyway, it was kind of an eye-opening lecture. She got a big round of applause. There's a tech thing in our culture, it's like tech can do no wrong, but it's like, well, really? It's done a lot of good, but at the same time, that from being in the Amish community, it's, we don't have these discussions as a culture generally about the latest thing that comes down the road, and we ought to, I think, but oh well.
I want to transition a little bit into more of your writing.
Sure.
One thing I was reading on your website, talking about the book The Sun.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the interesting couple of sentences describing a book that I just want to read it because I have to buy the book and read it now.
I would have brought you a copy, man.
Oh, shoot. Should have mentioned that. It involves a murdered ranch employee, a stolen rodeo horse, a black helicopter, angry environmentalists, menacing oil and gas developers, a missing Sasquatch hunter, a mysterious billionaire, and a misplaced can opener. Now, if that doesn't catch your attention, I'm not sure what will.
Well, what you're referring to is a mystery novel that I wrote. And, I'm a writer. I like to write in different genres. I feel like I've written a lot of nonfiction over the years, and so I got an idea a couple of years ago to try a hand at some fiction, and I had an idea for a murder mystery on a sustainable ranch for a long time, with a dead body and a cattle tank, and off we go, right? And so, I sat down a couple of years ago and wrote it. Because I don't have a fiction background and audience, I couldn't really interest the industry in it, so I just published it myself. And so I'm about halfway through the sequel, but I'm back on nonfiction right now, and okay. I'm finding the fiction thing just slowed down. I'll get to it. It's a whole series. It's set on a ranch, mythical ranch, northern New Mexico. It's a lot about New Mexico. It's a lot of the cultural issues. It's set in 2008, which is, I think, an important period of time for us, a lot before the crash of the stock market and a lot of other things. And so just a cast of characters. A young doctor in Boston inherits this ranch from a wealthy uncle she didn't know, and she flies out to sell it, and it gets complicated. And so I wanted to take all the things I learned through Kuvira and nonfiction and put them in a fiction format. And I think it went well. It didn't sell. And so, there's a million mysteries out there. Everybody's publishing. I read somewhere 68,000 books are published every day now, because there's so much. It's all most of it's self-published. Mm-hmm. It's just a huge, huge market. But it's something I wanted to do for myself. I wrote another novel on something else. Now I'm back on nonfiction. So it's.
And where can people find your books?
Well, the novel they can it's on Amazon. Courtney White, The Sun. You can find it, or go to the website. We'll link it. Well, it'll link you back to Amazon, so it's available there. And I've got 5 or 6 copies sitting at home. Or give me a holler before you guys head out. I can give you a copy, or buy a copy. So it's I found in fiction not a lot of these issues, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about, in general, there's a lot of misunderstanding in urban populations about farming, right? And we just, we have stereotypes, and, they're pretty strong still. And so I thought, well, let's take a format, particularly in northern Mexico, with a lot of diverse cultures, and explore some of these in a fiction format. So,
and I would say that you're right, and I'm glad that you're kind of making it a fun interpretation of a farmer and a rancher, because you're right. In an urban population, there's still the old, cowpoke type stereotype,
the rural rube kind of.
But I think a lot of people are coming to the same conclusion that you came to a long time ago, 20, 30 years ago, that what farmers do is, first of all, extremely complex, and if they do it right, it can have major impacts across the entire landscape, including where these people.
And I think in the last 10 years, I think that educational part is grown. I think more people understand now that if you want good food, you have to have farmers. The good food's just not going to show up, in your store. So we want to be supportive of the farming community. The animal agriculture part of it just gets politically complicated because there's so many folks dead. One of the things that really shocked me was just the negative attitude towards cattle in general, not just by any particular group, but just kind of in general. And it surprised me because humans have had a long history with cattle. 8,000 years of bovine relationship, whether it's plowing or meat or milk or whatever, herding. We kind of grew up with livestock. And then suddenly livestock are all bad. Well, it's sort of an odd thing to adopt after all these years. And so, there's overgrazing. There's industrial agriculture. This all can be corrected. But the general bovine thing. It's just it caught me by surprise when I and you still see that in general populations, but I think maybe less so today. I don't know. It's hard to say.
That's one. If there was one thing that we could convey to our listeners about farmers is, farmers are a lot smarter than people give them credit for. And the second thing is they work in a system that is more dependent on factors out of their control than any other industry.
Right.
Because if you get 2 weeks of rain
Right.
during first cutting hay,
Right.
in my region, that's going to follow you for a year.
Right.
So it's like it really bothers me when they look at farmers as the old coverall wearing,
Right.
straw hat with a piece of straw in his
Right,
mouth,
right.
clueless Joe.
Redneck.
That bothers me.
I'm working with a farmer in a book right now. I love. He has a phrase. He says, "Farming isn't rocket science; it's more complicated than that." And anybody who's been in farming understands what he means. It's more complicated than rocket science because you got all those moving parts, and then you throw in, the regenerative stuff. You're measuring carbon and microbes and all that below ground stuff that's going on. He's excited because he thinks that, in particular, what he's doing, technology is helping because they're actually being able to measure stuff more carefully. But yeah, no, it's not rocket science. It's more complicated than rocket science, and that's it's hard for urban populations to understand. But and that's partly what I see my role as, is trying to explain all this to broader publics. So
Well, that's exactly why we wanted to have you on, and that's why we do this podcast too. So, but we really appreciate the time. It was a great chat, and thanks for having us down here.
Oh, sure, I appreciate it. It's I don't know much about podcasting. Everybody says that I should do it, but I don't have time. I'm glad you guys are doing it. So. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
One more thing I want to say is his
Sure.
website is CourtneyWhite.com.
Right.
For more information, and there's a lot of information on your website.
And I'm in the process of adding more, not just about agriculture, other interests too, other things I've been writing about. So, good. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for.
Well, thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to another episode of Back to the Roots podcast, brought to you by Albert Lee C.